The reading of my father's will was supposed to be straightforward. Everyone knew what was coming. Jake would get everything, just like he'd gotten everything his whole life. The ranch, the cattle, the mineral rights, all of it. And me? I sat there in that stuffy lawyer's office, watching my brother's smug face as Mr. Henderson read through the provisions, knowing I'd be lucky to get anything at all. When the lawyer finally got to my name, his voice carried a note of confusion that made everyone lean forward. "To my daughter Emma," he read, adjusting his glasses, "I leave the horseshoe." Just that. The horseshoe. Jake's laughter filled the room before Mr. Henderson even finished the sentence. My stepmother Patricia covered her mouth, trying to hide her smile. Even my cousin Derek, who'd only shown up hoping for a mention in the will, shook his head in disbelief. A horseshoe. After 23 years of being treated like I didn't belong in my own family, my father's final message to me was a rusty piece of metal that probably fell off one of the horses years ago. The morning sun caught the dust motes floating through the lawyer's office window, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't the inheritance itself. I'd long ago stopped expecting anything from my father. It was the public humiliation of it all, the final confirmation that I'd never mattered. Patricia's perfectly manicured hand reached across to pat mine with fake sympathy. "Oh, honey," she cooed, her voice dripping with the same false sweetness she'd perfected over the past 15 years. "Your father always had such an interesting sense of humor." Jake sprawled back in his chair, his boots already marking the expensive leather like he owned the place, which I suppose he did now. "Come on, Em," he said, using the nickname he knew I hated. "At least you got something. That's more than most people expected. If you're watching this because you've ever felt like the forgotten one in your family, like no matter what you did, you could never measure up, I need you to stay with me. Because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my father, my family, and the real reason I'd been pushed aside my entire life. Sometimes the smallest gifts carry the biggest secrets, and sometimes the people who seem to have won everything have actually lost the only game that matters. My name is Emma Grace Thornton, though for most of my life, I might as well have been invisible. When my mother died giving birth to me, my father remarried within a year. Patricia brought Jake with her from her first marriage, and suddenly, at barely a year old, I went from being the daughter of a grieving rancher to the inconvenient reminder of a woman my new family wanted to forget. The Double Arrow Ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of Montana grassland, with the Rocky Mountains rising like ancient guardians in the distance. It was the kind of place that had been in the Thornton family for 4 generations, built on cattle, hard work, and the kind of stubborn pride that ran in our blood like iron. Growing up, I learned quickly that there were 2 types of people in our house, those who belonged and those who were tolerated. Jake belonged. From the moment he arrived, my father treated him like the son he'd always wanted. At 6 years older than me, Jake was everything my father valued: loud, confident, good with the cattle, and quick with the kind of rough charm that made people forget to look too close at what lay beneath. He called my father Dad from day one, while I spent years trying to earn a smile from the man whose blood I actually carried. Patricia orchestrated our family dynamics like a master conductor. She never openly mistreated me. She was far too clever for that. Instead, she wielded disappointment and concern like weapons, always making sure my father noticed my failures while Jake's were quietly swept away. When I was 7, I spent weeks teaching myself to ride bareback because Jake said real cowboys didn't need saddles. The day I finally managed to stay on for a full minute, Patricia found me practicing. "Oh, Emma," she'd sighed, loud enough for my father to hear from the barn. "You're going to hurt yourself trying to keep up with Jake. Some people are just naturally gifted with horses, sweetheart. There's no shame in being different." By the time my father came to check on the commotion, she'd already convinced him I'd been recklessly endangering myself, trying to show off. Jake got praised for his natural ability. I got a lecture about knowing my limitations. The pattern established itself early and never changed. When Jake got drunk and crashed the ranch truck into a fence post at 16, Patricia spun it as a learning experience about responsibility. When I got straight A's and a full scholarship to Montana State, she wondered aloud at dinner whether I was trying to make the rest of the family feel inferior with my book learning. My father nodded along, adding that ranch work was honest work, and maybe I thought I was too good for it. I wanted to scream that I'd begged to help with ranch work my whole life, but Jake had always been given those responsibilities while I was relegated to helping Patricia with the house, a domain where I could never do anything right either. The worst part was how they made it seem like love. Every slight came wrapped in concern for my well-being. Every opportunity taken away was for my own good. When I was 14, my father had promised to teach me to train horses. It was the one thing I'd shown real talent for, the one time I'd seen pride flicker in his eyes when he watched me work with a particularly difficult mare. But the next day, Patricia had a conversation with him about how dangerous it was, how I was too small, too fragile. Jake ended up getting the training instead, and within a month he'd grown bored and abandoned it. The mare I'd been working with was sold because no one had time for her. There was only one person who ever saw through it all. My grandmother, my father's mother, who lived in the old homestead cabin on the far edge of the property. Grandma Rose was 93 when she died, and she'd spent her last 5 years watching her son be led around by his new wife with a combination of disgust and resignation. "Your mama would have hated this," she told me once, her weathered hands holding mine as we sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple. "She had fire in her, just like you. Don't let them put it out, Emma. Sometimes the strongest steel has to go through the hottest fire." She passed when I was 18, right before I left for college. At her funeral, I heard Patricia whisper to someone that it was probably for the best. Rose never quite accepted the new family dynamic. Jake gave a speech about how Grandma Rose had taught him the value of hard work, which was rich considering she'd barely spoken to him after the time he'd tried to convince my father to put her in a nursing home so they could renovate the cabin into a guest house. College was my escape, but even there, the shadow of my family followed me. My scholarship covered tuition, but nothing else. When I asked my father for help with books and housing, knowing he'd paid for Jake's failed attempt at community college without blinking, he told me that if I wanted to abandon the family ranch, I could figure out how to pay for it myself. I worked 3 jobs to get through school, including mucking stalls at a stable near campus, which felt like the universe's cruel joke. I graduated with honors and a degree in veterinary science, specializing in equine medicine. My father didn't come to the graduation. Patricia sent a card that said, "Congratulations on your little degree." After college, I found work at a veterinary clinic in Billings, 2 hours from the ranch. Close enough to visit, far enough to breathe. I built a quiet life for myself, surrounded by horses that needed healing and people who valued what I could do. But I still went home for holidays, still subjected myself to their casual cruelty, because some part of me, the little girl who'd spent years trying to earn her father's love, couldn't quite let go. The last Christmas before my father died was the worst. Jake had just gone through his 3rd divorce, and his latest business venture, a guided hunting operation he'd convinced my father to fund, had failed spectacularly. But at dinner, while Patricia carved the turkey, my father raised his glass to toast his son's entrepreneurial spirit and the exciting new opportunities ahead. When I mentioned I'd just been promoted to head veterinarian at my clinic, the youngest person ever to hold the position, Patricia had changed the subject to ask if I was seeing anyone, because a woman approaching 30 should really be thinking about settling down. My father's health declined rapidly after that. The cancer appeared suddenly and spread quickly, taking him from diagnosis to death in just 4 months. I took leave from work to help care for him, driving back and forth to the ranch, sleeping in my childhood room that Patricia had long since converted to storage. even dying. My father couldn't bring himself to show me affection. His last words to me were to ask if Jake had arrived yet. Jake, who'd shown up twice during the entire illness, both times reeking of whiskey and making everything about himself, which brought us to this moment, sitting in Mr. Henderson's office, listening to the will that surprised no one. The ranch, with its 3,000 acres and profitable cattle operation, went to Jake. The house went to Patricia, along with a generous trust fund. Various cousins and ranch hands received small bequests, and I got a horseshoe. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable as he continued reading. The horseshoe in question is currently stored in the ranch safe. Your father's instructions were very specific. It must be given to Emma personally, and no one else is to handle it. Jake snorted. Probably wanted to make sure we didn't throw it away by accident, he said. Though honestly, Em, if you don't want to drive all the way out to the ranch for a piece of junk, I totally get it. Patricia was already standing, gathering her purse, ready to move on to the celebration she'd probably been planning since my father's diagnosis. We'll have it ready for you whenever you want to pick it up, dear, she said, her tone suggesting she expected me to decline, to finally acknowledge my place as the family afterthought. But something in Mr. Henderson's expression stopped me from nodding along. He was watching me with an intensity that seemed odd for a lawyer who'd just distributed millions in assets and was down to the final trinket. Miss Thornton, he said carefully, your father was very particular about this bequest. He insisted it be retrieved from the safe within 48 hours of the will reading. Jake laughed again. Or what? The horseshoe turns back into a pumpkin? But Mr. Henderson wasn't smiling. Or it becomes part of the general estate, he said quietly. The drive to the ranch that afternoon was surreal. I'd made this journey hundreds of times, but never as such a complete outsider. The gates to the Double Arrow still bore our family brand, but I knew they weren't really mine anymore. Had never been mine, if I was honest. The house looked the same as always, imposing and coldly beautiful against the mountain backdrop, like Patricia herself. Jake's new truck was parked at an angle across two spaces, because even in victory, he had to take up more room than necessary. They were already celebrating when I arrived. Through the window, I could see Patricia pouring champagne, Jake's booming laugh echoing across the yard. Several of their friends had materialized, the vultures who always appeared when there was something to gain. I knocked on my own front door, former front door, and waited. Patricia answered, her smile bright and false. Emma, we weren't sure you'd come. Jake was just saying he could have someone drop the horseshoe off at your apartment, save you the trip. Behind her, Jake raised his champagne glass in a mock toast. To Emma and her horseshoe, he called out, and the room erupted in laughter. The safe was in my father's study, a room I'd rarely been allowed to enter as a child. It smelled like leather and his pipe tobacco, ghost scents that made my chest tight. Patricia made a show of not knowing the combination, requiring Jake to come in, grumbling about the interruption to his party. 37, 12, 45, he muttered, spinning the dial. Dad's birthday. Except it wasn't. My father's birthday was March 12th, not December. Jake was using Patricia's birthday. Something cold settled in my stomach as I watched him open the safe that had supposedly held my father's most important documents. Inside, among the papers and manila envelopes, was a small wooden box, worn smooth with age. Jake grabbed it carelessly, shoving it at me. There you go. One horseshoe, as promised. Try not to spend it all in one place. His friends laughed from the doorway where they'd gathered to watch the show. I opened the box slowly, my hands steadier than I felt. Inside, wrapped in faded blue velvet, was indeed a horseshoe. But even in the dim light of the study, I could tell it wasn't ordinary. It was heavy, far heavier than iron, and when I lifted it, the metal caught the light with a deep, rich gleam. Is that... Patricia stepped forward, her voice sharp. Let me see that. But I closed the box, something in my grandmother's voice echoing in my memory. My father left it to me, I said quietly. Just me. Jake reached for the box, but I stepped back. Come on, don't be ridiculous. If it's actually worth something, we should have it appraised. Make sure it's divided fairly. The irony of Jake talking about fairness while standing in the house he'd stolen piece by piece wasn't lost on me. "The will was very clear," Mr. Henderson said from behind us. He'd arrived so quietly, none of us had noticed. "The horseshoe belongs to Emma, and Emma alone. Any attempt to contest that particular bequest would call the entire will into question. I'm sure no one wants that." The threat was subtle but clear. Patricia's face went pale, then red. Jake's hand dropped to his side. "Fine," he spat. "Take your horseshoe and get out. You got what you came for." I left with the box clutched to my chest, their laughter following me to my car. But for the first time in my life, their mockery didn't sting, because the weight of that horseshoe told me something they didn't. No, my father had left me something real, something valuable. And more importantly, he'd hidden it from them. The man who couldn't show me love in life had somehow protected this one thing for me in death. That night, in my apartment, I examined the horseshoe properly. It was definitely gold, probably worth enough to pay off my student loans and then some. But there was something else, something that made me stay up until 3 in the morning, turning it over in my hands. On the inside curve, barely visible unless you knew to look, were engraved words, worn but legible. "Rose's Freedom," my grandmother's name. And beneath that, a series of numbers that meant nothing to me. 41.465, 105, 8931. I should have been thinking about the gold, about what I could do with the money. Instead, I sat on my couch, running my fingers over those engraved words, trying to understand what my father had really left me. The horseshoe was valuable, yes, but it was also a message, a puzzle. And puzzles, I'd learned from years of being the outsider, often held the most important truths. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Something told me I needed to understand this inheritance before Jake and Patricia figured out it might be more than just a valuable trinket. I started with the obvious, researching the horseshoe itself. The gold was real, that much was certain. Based on weight and current prices, I was looking at maybe $70,000. Life-changing money for someone who'd been counting pennies since college, but hardly the fortune that would make Jake and Patricia rage with envy. But those numbers bothered me. They looked like coordinates. I pulled up a mapping program on my laptop, typed them in, and felt my heart skip. The location was on the ranch, but not anywhere near the main buildings. It pointed to a spot in the far northern section, past my grandmother's old cabin, in an area that had been unused pasture for as long as I could remember. My father had always said the soil there was too rocky for grazing, the terrain too rough for cattle. Jake had never shown interest in it because it couldn't make him money. I drove back to the ranch that afternoon, my heart pounding. The main house was empty. Patricia had probably taken Jake to town to celebrate properly. I parked at my grandmother's cabin, now standing empty and already showing signs of neglect. From there, I hiked north, following the coordinates on my phone's GPS. The terrain was rough, just as my father had always said, but there was something else. Old fence posts, weathered but deliberately placed, marking a path that had been unused for decades. The coordinates led me to what looked like a natural depression in the land, hidden by overgrown sage and juniper. But as I pushed through the brush, I found something that made me stop breathing. A door. It was built into the hillside, so well concealed that you'd never see it, unless you were standing right in front of it. The wood was old but solid, reinforced with iron that had been maintained despite the remote location. And there, at the center, was a lock, an old padlock that looked like it had been waiting for decades. My hands shook as I pulled out the horseshoe. It was a guess, but the shape was right, the curve perfect. I fitted the horseshoe into the space where a key would go and turned. The lock opened with a click that seemed to echo across the empty landscape. The door swung inward, revealing darkness that smelled of earth and secrets. I turned on my phone's flashlight and stepped inside. What I found changed everything. The space was larger than I'd expected, carved into the natural rock but reinforced with timber. It was dry, preserved by the high desert climate and careful construction. And it was full. Not of gold or money, but of documents. Hundreds of them, organized in files and boxes, each one labeled in my grandmother's careful handwriting. Land deeds, mineral rights, water rights, contracts dating back to the 1920s. And in the center of it all, a letter with my name on it, though written in my grandmother's hand, not my father's. I sat on a crate and read by the light of my phone, my grandmother's voice echoing in my head with each word. My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, then you found Rose's freedom, and your father kept his promise to me. I'm sorry for all the years of pain you've endured, but please understand, this had to be done correctly, legally, in a way that couldn't be contested. Your father was weak, yes, but he wasn't entirely lost. When I saw what Patricia was doing to him, to you, I knew I had to act. These documents tell the real story of the Double Arrow Ranch. Your great-great-grandfather didn't just homestead this land, he purchased the mineral rights to nearly 10,000 acres of surrounding territory, including what's now the ranch. But he was smart. He kept the mineral rights separate from the land ownership, hiding the documentation because he'd seen too many families torn apart by greed. For generations, this secret passed from mother to daughter, your great-grandmother to my mother-in-law, from her to me. It should have gone to your mother, and from her to you. When she died, I had to make a choice. Your father had already remarried, and I could see Patricia's influence growing. If she knew about the mineral rights, she'd have found a way to steal them. So I made a deal with your father. He would put the ranch in Jake's name, let Patricia think she'd won everything. But the horseshoe, the key to this room, would go to you. The horseshoe that has been in our family for over a century, made from the first gold found on this land. Your father agreed because, despite his weakness, some part of him knew the truth, that Jake might get the ranch. But you, Emma, you are the ranch. The documents in this room prove that the mineral rights to the Double Arrow and the surrounding territory belong to you. Not to the ranch, not to Jake, but to you personally, passed down through a trust established in 1923. Your great-great-grandmother Rose, my namesake, made sure of it. She'd seen what happened when men controlled everything, and she protected her daughters the only way she could. There's more. 3 years ago, a geological survey was done on the Northern Territory. I hired the company myself, quietly. There are significant natural gas deposits, along with rare earth minerals that are becoming increasingly valuable. Conservative estimates put the value at over $200 million, possibly much more. The energy companies have been sniffing around for years, but your father always refused to sell or lease because he didn't actually have the rights to do so. Only you do. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. Patricia had eyes everywhere, and I couldn't risk her finding out. Your father and I agreed that you had to leave, had to build a life away from the ranch so that when this moment came, you'd be strong enough to stand on your own. Every cruel word, every slight. I watched it all and hated myself for not intervening. But I knew that if you stayed, if you were dependent on them, Patricia would find a way to manipulate you into signing away your birthright. The lawyer, Henderson, knows some of this. His father was my lawyer, and he's been holding additional documents. Once you've claimed the mineral rights, contact him. He'll help you navigate what comes next. And Emma, what comes next is your choice. You can lease the rights and become wealthy beyond Patricia's wildest dreams. You can sell them and walk away forever, or you can use them as leverage to take back what was always yours. The ranch may be in Jake's name, but without the mineral rights, it's just expensive grazing land. The real value, the real power, was always hidden beneath the surface. Like you, my dear one. They looked at the surface and saw nothing of value, but we know better, don't we? All my love, Grandma Rose. I read the letter 3 times before it fully sank in. Then I went through the documents, each one perfectly preserved, legally binding, irrefutable. My grandmother hadn't just protected my inheritance, she'd orchestrated a complete reversal of fortune that had been decades in the making. Every survey report, every offer from energy companies that had been mysteriously rejected, every year that the ranch had struggled while sitting on a fortune, It all made sense now. The sun was setting by the time I emerged from the hidden room, carefully locking it behind me. The horseshoe felt different in my hands now, not just valuable, but powerful. It was a key to a kingdom that Jake and Patricia didn't even know existed. I drove home in the dark, my mind racing with possibilities. For the first time in my life, I held all the cards. The question was how to play them. I spent the next 3 days researching everything. The geological surveys my grandmother had commissioned were thorough and undeniable. The natural gas deposits alone were worth a fortune, but the rare earth minerals were the real prize, essential for technology manufacturing and increasingly scarce. The documentation was bulletproof, the chain of ownership clear and uncontestable. Henderson confirmed it when I finally called him, his voice carrying a satisfaction that told me he'd been waiting for this moment as long as I had. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," he said. "She came to my father 40 years ago with this plan. Every document was crafted to be ironclad. There's no legal way for Jake or Patricia to challenge your ownership of the mineral rights. The ranch and the mineral rights were deliberately separated in the original homestead documentation. Your brother owns the surface, but you own everything underneath." I asked him to prepare the paperwork to formally claim the rights and register them in my name. Then I did something that would have seemed impossible a week ago. I hired a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but Miranda Chen, known for handling high-stakes property and mineral rights cases. If I was going to war with my family, I was going in armed. The energy company representatives started calling within days of the rights being registered. Word travels fast in those circles, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk to Emma Thornton, the woman who just inherited one of the most valuable undeveloped mineral deposits in Montana. The offers were staggering. Enough money to buy 100 ranches, to never work again, to disappear into a life of luxury that Patricia could only dream of. But I wasn't ready to decide yet. First, I wanted them to know. I wanted to see their faces when they realized that the worthless daughter, the afterthought, the girl who got a horseshoe as her inheritance, actually held their future in her hands. I chose my moment carefully. Patricia was hosting one of her charity galas at the ranch, the annual Harvest Moon benefit that she used to cement her position as the grand dame of local society. Everyone who mattered would be there, including the bank president, who'd been pressuring Jake about the ranch's mounting debts. Jake had been borrowing against the property for years, funding failed businesses and expensive divorces, always assuming there would be more money somewhere. I arrived late, after the dinner, but before the auction, wearing a simple black dress that had cost more than my usual monthly budget. Patricia saw me first, her smile freezing when she noticed the confident way I walked through her crowd. "Emma, we didn't expect you." I smiled back, the kind of smile I'd never been able to give her before. "I wouldn't miss it, Patricia. After all, family should support each other." Jake was holding court near the bar, telling the same stories about ranch life that he'd been recycling for years, playing the role of the rugged cowboy heir. He noticed me and waved dismissively. "Hey, Em, come to donate your horseshoe to the auction?" The group around him laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Actually," I said, loud enough for the conversation to die around us, "I came to discuss the future of the double arrow. I thought everyone should hear it from me first." Patricia materialized at Jake's side, her social radar detecting danger. "I'm not sure what you mean, dear. The ranch's future is secure with Jake." I pulled out my phone, showing them the email I'd received that morning. Interesting, because Energy Corps International seems to think differently. They've offered me $230 million for the mineral rights to the property, my property. The silence spread like ripples on water. Jake grabbed my phone, staring at the screen. "This is fake. This has to be fake." But Patricia had gone pale. She was smart enough to recognize the company name, smart enough to know that offers like this didn't come from nowhere. "What mineral rights?" she whispered. "The ones that have been in my family for over a century," I said, pulling out copies of the documentation. the ones my grandmother protected and my father made sure I inherited. You got the ranch, Jake, but I got everything underneath it, every drop of natural gas, every grain of rare earth mineral. And without my permission, you can't touch any of it. Jake lunged for the papers, but I stepped back. These are copies. The originals are with my lawyer. The word lawyer made him stop. This wasn't the Emma he knew, the girl who could be bullied and dismissed. You're lying, he said, but his voice cracked. Dad wouldn't. He loved me. He loved the idea of you, I said quietly. The son he thought he needed. But love and wisdom aren't the same thing. My grandmother saw what was happening. She protected what really mattered. The bank president, Harold Morrison, had moved closer, his interest obviously piqued. Miss Thornton, are you saying you own the mineral rights to the Double Arrow Ranch? I nodded. Every single one. Mr. Morrison, I know the ranch has significant debts. Jake's been borrowing against it for years. But here's the thing. A ranch without mineral rights in this market? It's worth maybe 1/10 of what he owes you. Jake's face had gone from red to white. You can't do this. We're family. I laughed, and it felt like freedom. Family? You've spent 20 years making sure I knew I wasn't family. Every birthday you forgot, every achievement you mocked, every moment you and Patricia made me feel like an outsider in my own home, that was you telling me I wasn't family. Patricia tried a different approach, her voice taking on that concerned tone I knew so well. Emma, sweetheart, you're upset. This is all overwhelming. Why don't we discuss this privately? But I was done with private discussions, with being handled and managed. No, Patricia. You wanted an audience for my humiliation my whole life. It's only fair you have one for this. I turned to address the room. All these people who'd watched me grow up as the forgotten Thornton, who'd pitied me at best and laughed at me at worst. The Double Arrow Ranch sits on one of the largest untapped natural gas deposits in the state, along with rare earth minerals essential for technology manufacturing. I own the rights to all of it. Jake owns the surface, the cattle, the buildings, the grazing land that barely breaks even. But the real wealth? That's mine. What do you want? Patricia's mask had finally slipped completely, showing the calculating coldness I'd always known was there. Money? We can work out a payment plan. Jake was shaking his head, still in denial. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. What do I want? I repeated, tasting the power of the question. I want you to know how it feels. To have something you thought was yours pulled away. To realize you're not as important as you thought you were. To understand that the person you dismissed and degraded actually held your future in their hands all along. I pulled out another document, this one from my lawyer. Jake, you have 3 months to pay off the ranch's debts. After that, the bank will foreclose. Without the mineral rights, you'll never get another loan. You could sell, but again, without the mineral rights, you're looking at maybe $2 million for the land, not nearly enough to cover what you owe. Or, I continued, watching their faces, you could sell to me. I'll pay off the debts and give you enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere far from here. Jake's hands were fists at his sides. You want the ranch? It wasn't a question. I want what was always mine, I corrected. What would have been mine if my mother had lived, if Patricia hadn't poisoned my father against me? But more than that, I want you gone. Both of you. I want you to pack up your things and leave, just like you always made me feel I should. The room was electric with tension and gossip. This would be the story everyone told for years. The night Emma Thornton revealed she was worth hundreds of millions, while her brother discovered he was essentially bankrupt. Patricia made one last attempt. Your father would be ashamed of you. My father was ashamed of me my whole life, I said simply. But in the end, he did one thing right. He kept his promise to his mother. He made sure the horseshoe came to me. I held up the golden horseshoe which I'd brought with me. This was the key to everything. The key to a room full of secrets, to wealth you couldn't imagine, to justice you never saw coming. Mr. Henderson stepped forward from where he'd been watching. "Miss Thornton's claims are entirely legal and binding," he announced to the room. "I can confirm that she is the sole owner of the mineral, rights to the Double Arrow Ranch and surrounding territories." The bank president was already pulling Jake aside, his expression grave. The conversation was short and ugly, ending with Jake storming out, Patricia hurrying after him. The party dissolved into chaos, everyone talking at once, the story already growing with each telling. But I didn't care about any of that. I walked out to the porch, looking over the land that had been in my family for generations, feeling for the first time like I belonged here. Miranda Chen, my lawyer, joined me. That was quite a performance. I shook my head. It wasn't a performance. It was 23 years of truth finally being spoken. She handed me a tablet with contracts already drawn up. Energy Corps wants to meet Monday. The offer is real, and it's just the beginning. With proper negotiation, we could get significantly more. "I don't want to sell," I said, surprising myself with the certainty. "I want to lease. I want the income stream, the control. I want to build something that lasts." Miranda smiled. Smart. The lease agreements could generate 15 to 20 million annually, possibly more as demand increases. Over the next month, everything unraveled for Jake and Patricia exactly as predicted. The bank called in the loans. Jake tried to fight it, tried to claim the mineral rights were part of the ranch, but the documentation was clear. He hired lawyers with money he didn't have, filed complaints that went nowhere. Patricia's social standing evaporated overnight. The same people who'd fawned over her now whispered behind their hands about how she'd stolen an inheritance from a motherless child. I made my offer through my lawyers, clean and simple. I would pay off the ranch's debts and give them $500,000 to relocate. In exchange, they would sign over the ranch and never return. It was generous, more than they deserved, but I wanted them gone more than I wanted revenge. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I was buying my birthright back with money from the very mineral rights they'd never known existed. Jake held out for 2 weeks, his pride warring with reality. But when the foreclosure notice was posted, he broke. The signing was quiet, held in Mr. Henderson's office. Jake couldn't look at me. Patricia managed one last barb. "You'll be alone out there. You've always been alone." I thought of my grandmother, of my mother, of the strength that had been passed down through generations of women who'd been underestimated. "I've never been alone," I told her. "I just had to find where I belonged." They left Montana the next week. I heard later that they'd moved to Arizona, that Jake was working as a ranch hand on someone else's land, that Patricia was selling real estate. I didn't follow up. They were part of a past I was finally free from. I moved back to the ranch on a crisp October morning, almost exactly a year after my father's death. The house felt different without their presence, lighter, cleaner, like it could finally breathe. I hired back the old ranch hands Jake had let go, people who'd known my grandmother and remembered my mother. They helped me restore the place to what it had been, a working ranch that honored the land instead of just exploiting it. The mineral extraction began 6 months later, carefully managed to minimize impact on the ranch operations. The first lease payment was $18 million. I used part of it to establish a veterinary clinic on the property, offering free services to local ranchers who couldn't afford care for their animals. Another portion went to restoring my grandmother's cabin, turning it into a guest house for the women's shelter in town, a place where those escaping bad situations could find peace and safety. But the best part was the horses. I brought back the breeding program my grandmother had started, focusing on rescue and rehabilitation. The mare I'd worked with as a teenager, the one Patricia had forced my father to sell, I tracked her down and brought her home. She was older, but she remembered me, nickering softly when I entered her stall for the first time in almost a decade. Mr. Henderson visited on the anniversary of the will reading. We sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple, just as I had with my grandmother years ago. "Your father came to me the week before he died," he said quietly. "He wanted to change the will, to give you the ranch. But your grandmother had made him promise, made him sign documents ensuring the horseshoe would go to you no matter what. She knew he was weak. She planned for it. Did he know? I asked. About the mineral rights? Henderson nodded. She told him at the end, when the cancer had already taken hold. She wanted him to know that you would be okay, that you would get justice. He cried, Emma. The only time I ever saw your father cry was when he realized what he'd let happen to you. I thought about that for a long time after Henderson left. My father's weakness had shaped my life, but my grandmother's strength had saved it. The horseshoe sat on my mantle now, polished and prominent, a reminder that sometimes the smallest gifts carry the greatest power. It had been the key to everything, to wealth, to justice, to freedom. But more than that, it had been a message across time, from one woman to another. You are valuable. You are worthy. You belong. The ranch thrived under my management. The cattle operation, freed from Jake's mismanagement and debt, became profitable again. The mineral leases provided steady income that I reinvested in the land and the community. I hired local people, supported local businesses, and slowly earned the respect that had always been given freely to Jake. But I didn't do it for them. I did it for the little girl who'd been told she was nothing, who'd believed it for far too long. 5 years have passed since that night at the charity gala. The Double Arrow Ranch is now one of the most successful operations in Montana, balancing traditional ranching with responsible resource management. I've expanded to 10,000 acres, buying up the surrounding properties as they became available. The veterinary clinic has grown into a teaching hospital, partnering with Montana State to provide hands-on experience for students. The rescue program has saved over 200 horses, many of them going on to become therapy animals for veterans and traumatized children. Jake reached out once, 3 years after leaving. He was drunk, calling from some bar in Phoenix, alternating between apologizing and accusing. I listened for a few minutes, then hung up. Patricia sent a letter through a lawyer, suggesting we could be a family again now that the misunderstandings had been resolved. I sent it back unopened. They were ghosts from a life I no longer lived, voices from a past I no longer heard. I thought I'd feel empty once I had my revenge, that the satisfaction would fade and leave me hollow. But the truth is, it was never really about revenge. It was about recognition, about claiming my place in a story that had been written to exclude me. My grandmother had seen it, had planned for it, had made sure that the truth would eventually surface like those minerals hidden beneath our land. Valuable, undeniable, worth the wait. The horseshoe still sits on my mantle, but now it's surrounded by other treasures. Photos of the horses we've saved, letters from families who've used the guest house, awards from the state for land conservation and community service. These are my inheritance now, the legacy I'm building on the foundation my grandmother protected. When young women visit the ranch, and many do, drawn by our programs for disadvantaged youth, I tell them the story. Not all of it, but enough. Enough for them to understand that sometimes being underestimated is a gift, that sometimes the people who dismiss you are actually freeing you to become who you really are. There's a plaque now at the entrance to the ranch, replacing the old double arrow sign. It reads, Rose's Freedom Ranch, where every story matters. My grandmother would have liked that, I think. The acknowledgement that this was always her victory, her long game played to perfection. She'd seen Patricia coming from the beginning, had recognized a gold digger with bigger ambitions than my father could handle. So she'd protected what mattered and trusted that truth, like minerals, would eventually rise to the surface. The mineral extraction will continue for decades, the contracts I've negotiated ensuring sustainable practices and fair compensation. The wealth it generates will outlive me, flowing into trusts and foundations that will support education, conservation, and women's independence for generations. But that's not what I think about when I ride across the ranch at sunset, the mountains casting long shadows across the grassland. I think about my mother, who died before she could pass down the secret. I think about my grandmother, who spent years watching me suffer so that I could ultimately triumph. I think about my father, weak and manipulated, but who in the end kept his promise to his mother. And I think about that horseshoe, sitting in a safe for years, waiting for its moment. Such a small thing, easy to dismiss, easy to mock. Jake and Patricia had laughed at it, had seen it as the perfect final insult to the unwanted daughter. They never imagined that something so seemingly worthless could be the key to everything. But then, they'd looked at me the same way, hadn't they? They'd seen something small and quiet and easy to overlook, never realizing that beneath the surface lay veins of strength they couldn't imagine. The sun sets now over my land, truly my land, and the horses in the near pasture lift their heads, whinnying their evening greeting. One of them, a bay mare we rescued from a kill pen last year, wears special shoes to help with an old injury. They're not gold, of course, just ordinary steel. But every time I hear her walk, that distinctive clip-clop of metal on stone, I remember that sometimes the most ordinary things carry the most extraordinary secrets. Sometimes a horseshoe is just a horseshoe, and sometimes it's the key to a kingdom that was always yours, waiting beneath the surface for you to be strong enough to claim it. I learned that the labels people give you only have power if you believe them. I learned that cruelty often comes wrapped in concern, that family isn't always blood, and that sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying those who hurt you. It's building something so beautiful that their absence becomes irrelevant. I learned that strength can skip a generation, passing from grandmother to granddaughter like a secret whispered across time. And I learned that sometimes, when you think you've lost everything, you're actually about to discover that you had more than you ever imagined. The ranch is quiet now as evening falls, peaceful in a way it never was when Jake and Patricia ruled it. The old house has been renovated, filled with warmth and light, and the laughter of the kids who come for our summer programs. My office is in what used to be my father's study, but I've changed everything about it. Where his safe once stood, there's now a display case holding the horseshoe, along with a photo of my grandmother and a letter she wrote me when I was 5, before Patricia intercepted my mail. It says simply, "You are loved, you are valuable, you belong." It took me 23 years to believe those words, but now I know them to be true. Not because of the mineral rights or the money or the ranch, but because I finally understand what my grandmother knew all along, that our worth isn't determined by those who refuse to see it. It's carried within us, patient and enduring, waiting for the moment when we're ready to unlock it and claim what was always ours. The horseshoe gleams in its case, catching the last light of day, a reminder that the smallest keys can open the biggest doors. And somewhere, I hope my grandmother is watching, satisfied that her plan worked exactly as she intended. She gave them the ranch, but she gave me the earth beneath it. She let them have the surface, but she saved the depths for me. And in those depths, I found not just wealth, but truth, not just revenge, but redemption, not just a fortune, but a future that no one can ever take away again.